Afternoon. Welcome to this latest Post-Brexit Clinic from Queen's University Belfast. I'm David Phinnemore and I'm hosting today's event. I'm joined by my colleagues Dr. Viviane Gravey, Professor Katy Hayward and Professor Melo Araujo. And we're going to be talking through a number of developments around the Windsor Framework and the UK-EU reset. And then that will include also some latest polling that we've been doing. And then we're happy to take questions at the end. The format, more specifically, is I'm going to start with some views on recent developments, so taking us back to the democratic consent vote back in December and looking at some of the events that have happened since. We're then going to hand over to Katy to talk us through some of the findings from the latest testing the temperature polling that we've been doing with Lucid Talk. The results of that came out, I think, last week or 10 days ago. Billy's then going to pick up on where we might be with Trump tariffs and Northern Ireland's rather unique position and what might be coming down the line there. And then we're going to focus a little bit more on the UK-EU reset, where Viviane's going to talk us through some of the key issues for Northern Ireland, particularly around this idea of an SPS agreement and what's happening on the trading scheme, the emissions trading scheme. That's it, yeah. Trading system, okay. And then I'm going to say a few words at the end about some of the issues which might be coming up over the coming months and years, just to whet your appetite for more on the Windsor Framework. So, good. Anyway, so let's just take a few moments to think back at what's happened since December last year, where we had for the first time this democratic consent vote in the Assembly, where MLAs voted in favour of maintaining the complete set of arrangements under the Windsor Framework, maintaining Northern Ireland's position in this unique set of trading arrangements for another 4 years. That's because we had only a simple majority of MLAs, 48 versus 36 in favour. What that means is that they will be coming back to consider the Windsor Framework again in 2024. If there'd been a cross-community majority, then we would have had the next vote in 2032, but there wasn't. Anyway, we'll pick up a little bit more on that maybe later. But that was a significant development because that was the first time when the Assembly really got to vote on Protocol Windsor Framework arrangements. Almost immediately after that, we saw a first attempted use of the Stormont Break. This is the arrangement that was introduced with the Windsor Framework, essentially allowing MLAs to request the UK government to pull the brake on the application of amendments to existing legislation applicable under the protocol. A symbolic moment because this was the first time that an attempt was made to pull the brake. We then move into January when, because the democratic consent vote was only passed by a simple majority of MLAs, there was no cross-community consent. The government was committed to establishing an independent review of the Windsor Framework. And that review was formally commissioned on the 9th of January when Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Hilary Benn, announced the appointment of Paul Murphy, former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, to conduct the review. Lord Murphy's got 6 months, essentially, to complete the review. And that's underway at the moment. And he will be reporting in July. The idea of the review is to consult widely with stakeholders and to identify developments in or around the Windsor Framework which may lead to it commanding cross-community support when we get the next democratic consent vote in 2028. Okay. We'll see what he comes up with in July. Okay. Then, following that, we had the UK government responding to the attempt to pull the Stormont Break by essentially rejecting the notification which had been submitted by unionist MLAs back in December. This was an important moment because, one, it confirmed that the UK government is essentially in control of this process. It is ultimately down to the UK government to decide whether the Stormont Break is pulled. But also it showed us the extent to which the UK government, or how the UK government's interpreting the rules here. And I think, having worked with colleague Lisa Whitten on this, we realise it's really, really difficult to actually pull the Stormont Break. The criteria are very, very strict, very difficult to achieve. And certainly the UK government's fairly detailed explanation was that it did not believe that those criteria had been met, and therefore it was not willing to see the brake being pulled. Okay. Now, disappointment obviously there for those unit MLAs who've been supporting the motion, but equally, on the other hand, others saying, well, actually, these are the rules, the criteria were not met, and therefore a case could not be made for pulling that brake. I'm sure this won't be the last time that we see an attempt made to pull the brake, but possibly next time round, MLAs might not be so willing to put forward a notification, mindful of the fact that the criteria are very, very difficult to meet, and a good case really needs to be made. Okay. What we then had was a couple of announcements subsequently, in which the UK government also picked up on another dimension to the Windsor framework, which is the applicability motion. This is where normally if the EU and the UK want to add a new piece of EU legislation to the Windsor framework, it must have cross-community support from MLAs through a so-called applicability motion. Now, if you read the fine print of the schedule in the Northern Ireland Act, it's actually there is an opportunity there for the UK government essentially to bypass the Assembly, provided that the new regulation does not create a new trade barrier. And this is where the UK government essentially said, okay, some new piece of legislation coming up do not create a new trade barrier, therefore we don't need an applicability motion. What it also was saying was that whereas last year the Northern Ireland Assembly failed to provide an applicability motion for the addition of a new piece of legislation on geographical indicators, the UK government's assessment was, well, actually that piece of legislation wasn't going to create a new trade barrier, and therefore it could ignore the failure of the Assembly to adopt an applicability motion with cross-community support and proceed to add that piece of legislation to the Windsor framework. Okay, so once again, an example here of a mechanism existing and the UK government responding in a fairly detailed manner, providing a justification for not necessarily requiring the Northern Ireland Assembly to vote on whether a new piece of legislation should be added to the Windsor framework. Something which has probably affected most people, or most people in Northern Ireland have been aware of, more so, will be the new regime which has come in for parcels. Key moment in the implementation of the Windsor framework, because this was a key concession on the part of the EU to what would have been the rules had the original protocol been fully implemented. Now, it's obviously caused a number of concerns because of the lack of clarity around some of the arrangements. But essentially now there's a set of arrangements there for moving goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, where you differentiate between goods going from businesses to consumers, consumers, or from businesses to businesses. All quite complex, and we'll be interested to see how this plays out in the coming months in terms of people's experiences as that is implemented fully. Okay. And then the other key development that we've seen over the last number of months is, and Billy will come on to this later, the arrival of President Trump in the White House and his various pronouncements around tariffs, whether to increase them, reduce them, stay them, delay them, or whatever, and what that might mean for Northern Ireland. Essentially, we're in a bit of a limbo. We're still trying to work out what's going to be happening. But as I said, Billy will talk us through a little bit more about that later. Okay. And then the most recent development is obviously the UK-EU summit last week, which was, I think, a genuine reset in the relationship, because the UK and the EU essentially now begin to agree a renewed agenda for cooperation. And they issued quite a significant statement, a so-called common understanding, in which they listed a reasonable number of areas where they now intend to cooperate quite closely, and in some instances proceed, so the hope is, fairly quickly to putting some new arrangements in place. Some of these are particularly important for Northern Ireland under the Windsor framework. The idea of establishing a sanitary and phytosanitary area and dealing with emissions trading systems. The idea here is, particularly with the first of those, that will have a significant impact on checks and regulatory requirements for goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. As I said, Viviane will talk us through a little bit more about that later on. What's also to note here is the fact that there's far more to the reset, to this common understanding than just sanitary, phytosanitary. There's issues of irregular migration being addressed. There's issues of youth experience, and also particularly arrangements around security and defence. And that's where a new security and defence partnership was signed or was agreed by the UK and the EU at the summit. General point here to make is that most of this is essentially political declarations, it's political commitment, and a lot of this has got to be worked through even further before we actually see any substantive change to the arrangements either in the UK-EU relationship generally or how they might impact on Northern Ireland and the implementation of the Windsor Framework. Okay, so quite a big agenda there being established. This will be the first of our annual summits, and so we'll probably see more happening this time next year, both in terms of reviewing what progress has been made and potentially what other areas there may be for further cooperation in due course. Okay, I think that's probably enough from me, except to show you this, courtesy of Katy. She pulled together the newspaper headlines from last week indicating the reaction to the reset. And as you can see there, there's a mixture from those possibly as expected from the Daily Mail, the Daily Mail and Daily Express, we'll talk about surrender and betrayal, across more to the right-hand side there, where you've got the likes of the Financial Times calling this welcoming the reset, and the likes of the Daily Mirror calling the deal a win-win. Okay, we yet to see the detail of how this is going to play out. Be interesting to come back to this in a year's time and work out the extent to which it is either surrender, betrayal, or it is actually a win-win solution. Okay, that's enough for me. I'm going to hand over now to Katy, who's going to talk us through the latest polling.
Thanks very much, David. So yes, I'm delighted that we're able to present to you some more polling data. Thanks to Lucid Talk, who it's a pleasure to cooperate with on this. We're able to continue to offer 2 polls now a year. So thanks to those who responded. The weighted sample that we're using here is just over 1,000, and the margin of error is plus or minus 2.3%. So I'm just going to present results, first and foremost, of questions that are very familiar to you now if you've been following our Testing the Temperature polling series. Those vertical lines on the graph there are intended to show you where the respective agreement and disagreement was about a year ago now for our June 24 poll, just to see where the movement has come from. And there's a couple of things worth noting on that. The first is in relation to the question of economic opportunities. So there's been a decline in those thinking that the Windsor Framework gives economic opportunities for Northern Ireland. This relates to other findings that come through in the poll, which is around the fact that a clear majority of people think that dual market access, for example, is being undersold. Secondly, we see that there's been an increase in those thinking that Brexit is on balance a good thing. And I think we have to see this in light of that Trump trade war issue, given that we saw the US-UK deal, such as it was, be seen as something that has only been able to be possible thanks to Brexit, and people definitely understanding the question of economic opportunities and trade now in light of the particular context set by President Trump. So that's all in the mix here when we're looking at these results. Now, as you know, we tend to zoom in on one particular question is around whether the Windsor Framework is on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. And now we've got some really interesting time series data. We can look back all the way to spring 21, not that it feels like we've been doing this for a long time. And what I really want to highlight is essentially what happened to slight unionists. So it's that dotted orange line there. You can see the opinion of those who describe themselves as slight unionist and how it's changed over time. So really they have moved the most. We saw after the Windsor Framework was agreed in spring 23 that encouraged many slight unionists to move towards thinking the Windsor Framework was on balance a good thing. And then we had over 50% of them thinking that it was on balance a good thing following that safeguarding the union deal. So we saw even though strong unionists moved slightly for a short period of time to think it was a good thing, it was definitely the slight nationalists who moved on that one. However, you can see now our most recent poll suggests that only a quarter now of slight unionists think that the Windsor framework is on balance a good thing. In other questions that we ask on the poll, this seems to come particularly around the fact that they no longer think or are convinced so much that economic opportunities arise from it. Another thing just worth noting is that there has been a decline in nationalists thinking it's on balance a good thing. So still a very strong majority of 83% or so of strong nationalists think it's on balance good, but that's been a decline of around 13 percentage points since pre-Windsor framework. So that's notable as well. Another set of questions we've consistently asked is around the impact of the Windsor framework and protocol. Again, I've used those vertical lines to show where movement has come, and we see it particularly on that question of whether it's a positive thing for the economy of Northern Ireland. So in June 24, we saw 54% of people thinking that it had a positive impact on the economy. That's dropped now, and there's been an increase in people thinking it's negative impact. Again, I think this is in light of the current global situation on tariffs and trade. We've also seen, on the positive side, a decline in those thinking that it has a negative impact on political stability in Northern Ireland and on British-Irish UK-EU relations. And of course, this is very much in response to the positive developments that we've had on that UK-EU relationship, British-Irish relationship, particularly since the new government came in, I think. We also asked questions on trust, and I thought it might be interesting to show you the time series of this. And I think probably what's striking here is how little movement there has been. So when it comes to people trusting in various actors to manage Northern Ireland's interests in relation to the Protocol Windsor framework, there's very strong consistency in levels of trust for the Irish government and the EU. With that orange dotted line, you can see levels of trust in the DUP went up when they left the executive, and then they went down when they re-entered the executive. So the Safeguarding the Union deal had a negative impact on trust in the DUP. Interestingly, too, there's been a decline in trust in the Northern Ireland executive since it was at the height of being restored. But full credit where it's due, there's been a very significant rise in levels of trust in the British government. So that's up now to double figures for the first time at 11%. We've also seen a decline in levels of distrust of the British government. So that is one significant change that we found in this particular poll. Now, I'll give you a little bit more data than maybe we typically do in the post-Brexit clinics, but just to show, because this is quite interesting, I think it tells you quite a lot about the reactions to the Windsor framework at the moment and the sense of stability around it. So we asked several questions around some of the issues that David was talking about there, the use of the applicability motions, the attempt to pull the Stormont brake. And you can see the difference between strong and slight unionists, those who are neither unionists nor nationalists, slight and strong nationalists. So just to highlight a few things there, clear majority of strong unionists thought that the MLAs were right to call for the use of the Stormont brake there back at the end of last year. We also see that a clear majority, so almost 9 out of 10 strong unionists think that MLAs should oppose new EU legislation being added to the Windsor framework, regardless of the political or practical consequences. We also see low levels of expectation across the board in terms of what Lord Murphy's independent review will lead to. And notably too, we see fairly typically nationalists and, so neither unionists nor nationalists, sort of in agreement about the UK government's response to the Stormont brake. They are also generally more positive around the opportunity for stakeholder engagement that the UK and EU offer. Also showing you here the difference in perspectives according to people's political affiliation in terms of whether full, faithful and timely implementation of the Windsor framework is a fair requirement for the UK-EU reset. That phrase is repeated often now at every opportunity by the EU, especially when it comes to its engagement with the UK. Strong unionists disagree that that's fair, so too do a third of slight unionists, but others and nationalists think that it's fair enough. We see too a difference between slight unionists and neithers and nationalists, and then strong unionists regarding the dual market access. So as I say, a clear majority thinking that it's being undersold. One thing is very interesting is this question of how much people think that they are really experiencing now the impact of the Windsor Framework in terms of Northern Ireland not being sold to by GB suppliers. And just as in 22, when we asked a question around goods that are missing on shelves, we saw their strong unionists much more likely to say that they couldn't find their usual products. Similarly to now, we see strong unionists, 85% of them saying they have direct experience of GB suppliers saying, no, they won't send something to them because of the Windsor Framework, compared to just 18% of strong nationalists. Now, we could interpret this as evidence of direct and very obvious discrimination, or we could suggest that maybe it does show you how important still political, cultural perspectives are when it comes to the Windsor Framework, hence why it's such a sensitive issue to manage. We also saw, relating to the topic that Billy's going to talk about next, on the question of US tariffs, whether our respondents think that the response to this from the UK and the EU will protect Northern Ireland's interests. We see much more confidence from nationalists and others in both the EU and the UK than unionists have in respect to the likelihood that Northern Ireland's interests will be protected in any such eventuality as a trade war. Last but not least, onto the question of the reset. We asked whether people approve of the government's policy of pursuing closer relations. We see female respondents much more likely than male respondents to approve of this pursuit of a closer relationship. And we also see a very clear difference between strong unionists and others. So 3/4 of strong unionists say no, they don't want that closer relationship. Notably, 2/3 of softer unionists do approve of that. And then last slide for me on our results is the question of what people would like to see prioritised from such cooperation. And we are hopeful, therefore, that most people will be quite pleased of those people who wanted to see that closer relationship, that the reset as it has been announced so far is more or less in line with what they would like, possibly with the exception of increasing trade in goods, which we will highlight, given that doesn't touch on customs, but potentially an SPS agreement and potentially a mobility agreement or experience for young people, UK-EU, is something that chimes with what most people in Northern Ireland would like to see from that reset. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Katie. Over to Billy to take us through developments around President Trump tariffs and where Northern Ireland sits in it all.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So unless you've been living under a rock for the past 2 months, you'll be aware that this new US administration, this Trump administration, has been very keen to impose a huge increase in tariffs across the board. And that's something that's affected Northern Ireland, as it has affected all other regions in the world. But it has affected Northern Ireland in specific ways, unique ways, because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So what I'm going to try to do here very briefly is to provide you with an overview of the situation and the potential impact of these tariffs and countermeasures to these tariffs on Northern Ireland. So what's this all about? So in order to understand these tariffs, I think you have to look at the tariffs on an individual basis. So some of the tariffs are sector-specific tariffs. They target specific products, and they're driven mostly by protectionist objectives. So think, for example, of the tariffs that are applicable on steel and aluminium or on cars. This is really about protecting the US domestic industry, which is maybe struggling to compete in a globalized economy. Then you have tariffs which are targeting specific countries. So here you can think about China, that's taking the brunt of these tariffs. And this is really motivated by geopolitical concerns that the US has. And the objective here is to either isolate China or to hurt China economically in some shape or form. And then you have the reciprocal tariffs, which were adopted early April, or universal tariffs. So these are tariffs that are applicable across the board, range to all products, to countries across the world. And essentially the only variation, you start with a base level of 10%, which is the tariff that's been applicable to the UK, and then they can be increased based on your trade deficit. And so this is intended to address concerns of the US administration relating to the trade deficit, but also I think something that's not really been talked about much is that the Trump administration is very keen to increase its tax revenue in order to reduce taxes domestically, right? So actually, when you look at these tariffs individually, you can all, you know, there's an objective rationale for them. I think where maybe trade policy analysts, trade economists or lawyers struggle is with the grand vision. How do all of these things relate to each other? Now, what's not controversial is that clearly this has or can or potentially will have an impact on Northern Ireland. It's something that's been picked up by the media. Now, to understand how it can impact Northern Ireland, I think the best way to explain it is to distinguish between Northern Ireland's ability to export goods to the US and its ability to import US goods. So as far as the exports are concerned, it's fairly straightforward in the sense that under the Windsor framework, Northern Ireland is still very much part of the UK customs territory. So goods that are produced, manufactured here in Northern Ireland are considered to be UK goods for customs purposes when they arrive in the US. So to the extent that the US has decided to apply lower tariffs on UK goods, Northern Ireland can benefit from that. The only tricky situation is that not all goods from Northern Ireland can be considered to be Northern Ireland goods for customs purposes. So think, for example, of goods that are imported into Northern Ireland, say from the Republic, and then exported to the US, or goods that are assembled, manufactured in Northern Ireland, but contain components from outside of the UK, right? So those goods may be considered, for example, as EU goods when they arrive at the US border. So it's not that straightforward, but in general terms, Northern Ireland goods should benefit from the lower tariff, so the 10% tariff, reciprocal tariff that was applicable to the UK. Within, you know, bear in mind that the EU was subject to a much higher, double that tariff rate, so 20% tariff. Now, when it comes to imports, so the ability of Northern Ireland businesses to import goods from the US, it becomes a bit more tricky. And that's because of the at-risk regime that the Windsor framework has created. So again, because Northern Ireland is part of the UK customs territory, that means that in principle, goods from the US coming to the UK should be subject to UK tariffs, and the UK has decided not to retaliate against the US, and in general applies fairly low tariffs. So if you're a business importing goods from the US, you're in a fairly good situation in the sense that your costs aren't going to be significantly high. The only issue with that is, of course, that if there is a tariff differential between the EU and the UK, in the sense that the EU applies higher tariffs on US goods, then any tariff differential will likely lead to a situation where you have to apply EU tariffs. So Northern Ireland businesses importing US goods would have to apply EU tariffs and then seek reimbursement if they're able to show that those goods do not move to the Republic. A further complication is that if the EU decides to retaliate against the US for these tariffs, then we're veering to the world of trade defense measures or trade remedies, and under the Windsor framework, Northern Ireland is required to apply those very high retaliatory tariffs on US goods. So that's an automatic application. Again, with the possibility of reimbursement, but there's always a cost associated with that. So one thing to bear in mind here is that the EU has held back on applying these trade remedies. So this is a potential problem. It's not one that has manifested itself so far. The other thing I wanted to talk about was this economic prosperity deal, right? So again, in the last I think, maybe a couple of weeks ago, maybe just under a couple of weeks ago, both the US and the UK announced with great fanfare that they had secured this historic deal to lower tariffs on trade between the US and the UK. And when we got wind of this story, as far as Northern Ireland was concerned, there were two issues which I thought were of relevance. Is first of all, to what extent would this deal significantly leads to tariff differentials between the EU and the UK on US imports, because then the at-risk regime would come into play and Northern Ireland would have to apply EU tariffs as opposed to UK tariffs. But also, more crucially, to what extent would there be regulatory commitments in this deal? And this mattered, of course, because at the same time we knew that the EU and UK were trying to come on to arrive at an agreement with respect to SPS. And if there were any regulatory commitments in the US deal, then that might jeopardize the EU-UK deal. Now, so what does this economic prosperity deal do in practice? Now, it's very important to understand that this is not a trade agreement, at least not in the traditional sense of the word. So it's not an international treaty. You know, most trade agreements take years to negotiate. They're hundreds, maybe sometimes even thousands of pages long, and they can contain legally binding commitments on tariffs, on services, or, you know, wide spectrum of economic activities. And also, the objective of these agreements is to improve trade relations, is to liberalize trade. So this is not what's happening here with this deal. So first of all, it's not a legally binding instrument. It's a political statement where the UK and the US made a number of political commitments to reduce tariffs in a very narrow category of products. So I've listed them here: cars, steel, beef, ethanol, and also maybe commitments on pharmaceutical drugs. So none of these are legally binding commitments so far. And what's really important to understand about this agreement as well is that it doesn't actually liberalize trade. The objective is to limit the damage caused by the Trump tariffs. So I'll give you two examples. First of all, the cross-sectoral, the tariff, the reciprocal tariff of 10% is still very much in place. That hasn't been removed by this deal. Second example with respect to cars. Now, the tariff that was in place on UK cars moved into the US, exported to the US, just over 2 months ago was around 2.5%. With the Trump tariffs, that was increased to 27.5%. With this deal, there's now commitment to reduce those tariffs to 10% within a quota of 100,000 units of cars. So the first 100,000 units of cars exported to the US will benefit from a 10% tariff. Anything beyond that will be subject to a 20% tariff. Now, 10%, 20%, that's much better than 27.5%, but it's also much worse than 2.5%, which was in place just over 2 months ago. Okay, so this is very much about damage limitation rather than lowering tariffs across the board and, you know, liberalizing trade with the US. So obviously, as far as the at-risk regime here, there's an issue, which is that the reduction of these tariffs on these very specific group of products will increase tariff differentials. Two things that have to be taken into account here is, first of all, they've not been implemented in practice, and also this is a very narrow list of products. So the impact might be quite limited, especially because these are not products that we trade a lot with the US. And the good news is that this deal doesn't actually contain any sort of regulatory commitments. So the US was pretty strong on the fact that it wanted the UK to address regulatory barriers to trade on things that you will have heard of, such as, you know, hormone-treated beef and chlorinated chicken and genetically modified organism. None of that is dealt with in this deal. So that, of course, leaves the door open for a EU-UK deal on SPS, which Viviane will now take over.
I've got my own. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about the UK-EU reset of last week. This is very much based on reading of what is, at this stage, still quite loose wording, and there's still so much that we need to see come from both sides before we can really discuss in practice the implication for GB and EU, but also especially for between NI and GB, right? So this is very much of a first go at it, and I'm sure over the next few months and potentially a few years, we can look into much more details. So I'm going to focus on the part of it, of the reset and of that common understanding document, and talk about strengthening our economies while protecting our planet and its resources, which is something that, of course, both the UK and the EU should be doing, I guess. So as part of that, that's objective, you can see three areas that I think is quite interesting to look at from a Northern Irish perspective. There's effort to kind of collaborate on electricity and potentially working towards the UK rejoining the EU electricity market, talk about an SPS agreement, and talk about linking both our emission trading system and also jumping on board the EU CBAM, so the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or at least having some kind of equivalence with our own UK homegrown CBAM, so that we don't have huge amount of paperwork and tariffs happening on GB goods when CBAM comes into effect on the 1st of January 2026. So a lot of this has been a very long time coming, and a lot of it we didn't know it was going to make it to the end until perhaps Sunday night. So, and of course, as I mentioned before, a lot of that is still very much to be worked for. But it's really interesting if you've been a long time EU-UK relations and Brexit watcher, a lot of the common points that are coming from this are things that would have been completely politically impossible from the previous UK government, in terms of this really goes against a lot of red lines that we would have heard from Conservatives government. It also goes into a direction that a lot of people would have said, well, of course, told you so. You can only get dynamic alignment. Yeah, you need dynamic alignment. You can't just have equivalence for things like SPS. What is really interesting to see as well is that we are seeing the Court of Justice make a bit of a comeback, but it's not the Court of Justice acting directly. It is through a resolution mechanism with an independent arbitration panel. So it's a kind of a halfway house here. And what we're seeing a lot of talking about decision shaping. And now that might look like not much, but actually what it is pointing at is that a lot of the best moment to really lobby in Brussels is when decisions are still being developed within the Commission. And actually having the UK involved and invited as much as possible when it comes to decision shaping is actually really good, the best place for non-member states to have any kind of influence. So there's a lot of pointing towards actually the UK, we would be very welcome to hear your views at that stage, but don't try to influence it to like later on because you have no formal say, but we want to hear what you have to say at the beginning. Now, there are still some points of divergence between the three cases of electricity, SPS and ETS around territorial scope. Most of it is really just GB-EU, but there's some discussion directly in the text around direct or indirect impact on Northern Ireland and on the Windsor Framework. In general, the main message is this is about GB-EU. The Windsor Framework stands. But what you're going to see is, for example, with SPS, is we have, if the agreement is fully applied, there's then the possibility for much fewer checks between GB and NI. When it comes to ETS, it's a bit of a weirder situation because the ETS a bit of the EU ETS applies in Northern Ireland when it comes to electricity. But for the rest of its economy, we are under the UK ETS. So it's this kind of extremely complex situation when it comes to climate and ETS and CBAM for Northern Ireland. There's also going to be a joint governance mechanism for 2 out of those 3, not for electricity. So if we look at first the wording, I mean, the wording is we're working towards, we're exploring the participation, it's the beginning. It may be the beginning of a beautiful friendship, but it is the beginning, right? Now, even if we talk about internal electricity market, there is some keywords here that, again, are making a bit of a comeback. We're talking about the level playing field. It's not just going to be about electricity. If we are linking our electricity markets more, then the UK, and especially GB here, is going to have to think around renewables policy, protection of the environment that is linked to electricity, but also state aid. If you're talking about state aid when it comes to nuclear and all this kind of thing, that may be within scope of this of the potential agreement on electricity. So this is not necessarily something easy for both sides to agree on. Now, of course, there's been some agreement on state aid for Northern Ireland. So here again, you could see the experience of Northern Ireland and of building the Windsor Framework can actually teach, potentially, hopefully, colleagues in GB to kind of better work with the EU on this. Now, when it comes to SPS, it's a really interesting one where we're talking about, SPS in general, so phytosanitary and sanitary products, but also regulation of live animals, rule on organics, and certain marketing standards. A key one here is going to be pesticides, where there's been lots of reports on how actually on pesticides we have had quite a lot of divergence between what GB has done since Brexit and what the EU and Northern Ireland have done in terms of both, the number of pesticides that have been approved, for how long they've been approved, and then the level of residues allowed on goods. And so this is an area where we have had practical divergence, and where this, if we were to actually get that SPS agreement, would see GB roll back a lot of its divergence. So here, so I mentioned on pesticides, I think it's really interesting that the text on dynamic alignment for SPS is a bit different than text on dynamic alignment for the other two cases, because it has the possibility of having some exceptions. Now, in any case, this dynamic alignment is always respecting the UK constitutional and parliamentary procedures, but for SPS, you have that option of, if it basically does not have a negative impact on UK-EU trade, and it doesn't undercut EU rules, you could have exceptions where the UK does not dynamically align and does its own thing. We are starting to see possibilities of where this could be asked for. So Steve Reed in the comments last week talked about how this could be, when we're talking about new kind of form of GMOs and precision breeding, where the UK, especially England, have moved in a slightly different direction than the EU. This could be an area where they're going to try to ask for that exception. And this actually raises a lot of concerns from a devolved perspective, because these are areas where England is moving in a certain direction, but Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland don't necessarily want to move in that same direction. Now, the big one is the ETS one. This, you will be able to have a look at the text. It is quite a long text. What is interesting here is that we are talking about linking the point of CBAM is all about carbon leakage, right? It is about the idea that we're having through our emission trading systems part of the economy that have to make much more efforts on reducing their emissions than potentially their international competitors. And so you're then putting a carbon border adjustment mechanism to kind of try to offset those risks of carbon leakage. And that's why, for now, it really focuses that discussion around linking around those sectors such as electricity generation, industrial heat generation, industry, domestic, international maritime transport, and domestic and international aviation. There is some possibility to expand it, which is interesting because the EU is revising its climate policy quite a lot. It has adopted ETS2 last year, which extends the number of sectors. There's again this idea of dynamic alignment with the UK constitutional and parliamentary procedures. And this matters a lot because the UK has for a long time, whether it's still the case is questionable, but it has been one of the front runners in terms of climate action and also in terms of climate law. So it has very clear Climate Change Act obligations. And so this is very much listed in. And so the idea is not to have the UK follow what the EU does, but really keep on building on its own domestic system. Now, the implication of this for Northern Ireland are completely unclear so far, because again, Northern Ireland is very much almost all in the UK ETS, and just a little bit in the EU ETS. What we know, of course, is that if there is clear linkage between those ETSs and less just barriers to trade, kind of carbon credits, for example, between the two, but also a united kind of carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's just going to have it's going to lead to less friction. So it should be good news for Northern Ireland, but really here we have to look at the details, and we just don't have the details yet. Now, what is interesting though, if we are thinking back to what environmental groups, for example, would have liked to see in this reset, is, and even if we actually look at the first use of the salmon break, there's a lot of questions around chemicals policy between the UK and the EU. And pesticides in an area where we've seen obvious divergence, chemicals is another one. And there's very, very little on chemicals. We're just talking about chemical security should be part of regulatory exchanges at all levels. That is much, much weaker than what we're seeing across the rest. And it could be, I think it may be due to the fact that the EU is going to be revising its chemicals policy in the coming years. And so, further cooperation between the UK and the EU need kind of to wait for the EU to be clear on what it should be doing. We're seeing very little on climate cooperation. And when we see the Trump administration do so much against climate, this would have been a moment for the UK and the EU to restate their very strong commitment to climate cooperation. And they barely touch upon it. A few weeks back, we had our first arbitration case, the sand eels case, under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That was because the UK had banned the fishing of sand eels in marine protected areas, which was seen as a fisheries issue from the EU, was seen as a nature and an environmental protection issue from the UK. What's really interesting is we talked a lot about fisheries in this deal. We talk very little about nature, and we try to, so there is again that potential area of friction where we try to move to really not engage with. And for all of the discussion around working together, there's very little here around actually having the UK back in the room when it comes to some of the EU agencies, such as the European environmental agencies. You do not have to be an EU member to be part of. And if you want to see this kind of practical cooperation and more than decision shaping, then you want to have the UK back in.
Okay. Thanks very much, Viviane. I'm going to say a few words now about what might be coming up. Hopefully what will be coming up is a few questions from you. So if you have got some questions, do please put them in the chat. I'm sure I'll have some from my colleagues around here, but it'd be good to hear from you as well. Okay, so as Viviane has said, lots in the common understanding, lots still to be worked out in terms of the substance of that, and then a lot then to be worked out in terms of what its implications are for Northern Ireland under the Windsor framework. So plenty for us to get our heads around over the coming months, as Viviane said, possibly years as well. Okay, so it's one of the realities of being on the outside of the EU. You're in a perpetual set of negotiations, always trying to find your position and reacting quite often to what's happening on the EU side. Anyway, we'll come to that in due course. As I said earlier, there's a number of issues coming up which go beyond what we've been discussing today, and it's worth bearing those in mind if you're following the Windsor framework. And just want to give you a taste of some of those. July could be an interesting month. It's always an interesting month in Northern Ireland, but it could be a particularly interesting month this year because we've got the third stage of implementation of the labelling requirements for goods coming from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And this is where, according to some people, there are concerns that certain products may no longer be available in the shops in Northern Ireland because suppliers in GB are unwilling to meet the labelling requirements so that they can be sold here. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. As mentioned earlier, we've also got the report of the independent review. That will be issued, I think the deadline for Lord Murphy is the 9th of July. Happens to be, I think, the same date that the US tariffs apply. And then we'll see the reality of what some of what Billy's been saying coming in, assuming that President Trump keeps to that timeline. Okay, so there could be a lot of things happening in July for us to get our head around and interpret. And then what we've also got coming up in October is a really important Supreme Court hearing on the appeal of the government relating to Article 2. Now, we've not mentioned Article 2 today and the no diminution of rights clause there, but that's going to be a really important case for our understanding of the significance of Article 2 for the UK as a whole. Another issue coming up later this year is that the grace period which exists for veterinary medicines will end. Veterinary medicines has not been addressed as part of the UK-EU reset. It's causing concern because There are worries that certain medicines will not necessarily be available in Northern Ireland from the end of December. That said, there is a working group within the Cabinet Office in London, supposedly working quite furiously on trying to get an agreement in place with the EU so that any disruption is minimised and kept to a minimum. But we've not seen any announcements on that, so there may be an announcement in the coming months to address that issue. As we move into 2026, the UK government has to respond to the independent review and any recommendations that Lord Murphy makes, and then the UK government is then committed to actually giving them to the EU, raising them at the Joint Committee, and then presumably trying to implement those which within its gift to address. So that will be interesting to see there, and obviously the reaction which we'll get from political groups here, whether they think Lord Murphy's gone far enough, whether the review has actually delivered anything of substance. I think going back to what Viviane was saying, next year is going to be really interesting in terms of seeing the detail of whatever is agreed between the UK and the EU in terms of an SPS agreement, in terms of an ETS agreement, potentially an electricity agreement as well. The expectation is that both sides will move fairly quickly towards defining their positions for negotiations, then negotiations will open, and depending on how much has already been pre-agreed, they may proceed quite quickly, but equally, as Billy has said, trade negotiations often take years. As a benchmark, we might look to the way in which the EU and the Swiss agreed a common understanding. It then took them a year to negotiate the agreements within that, and that included an advanced SPS type agreement. A lot depends on the political will that exists, and also capacity. I think we have to remember here that the EU, particularly on the trade side, has got a hell of a lot going on at the moment, and the UK is just one of a whole variety of partners. That said, was pointed out to us the other day that when President von der Leyen, European Commission President, is determined to get something done, and it's she who agreed the common understanding with the Prime Minister, then you will probably get the political drive taking place within the Commission to at least get the Commission to a point where it's putting forward something to the Member States for them to agree for the negotiations. So a lot going to be happening next year in this space, and a lot for us to analyse. 2027, we will have an election here, which obviously is going to be significant. Well, we're assuming we'll have an election here to the Assembly. That will have implications for the makeup of the Assembly for 2028, when MLAs will come and get back again to consider whether they want to give the continued application of the Windsor Framework their democratic consent. Okay. On top of all this, we've got the fairly, well, some for politically contentious, but equally mundane, evolution of EU legislation. So there's going to be plenty of work still ongoing for the Democratic Scrutiny Committee in the Assembly, scrutinising changes to legislation coming through. There's also going to be examples of new legislation coming through, and we know full well that the EU has said that it wants more of the EU AI Act to apply in Northern Ireland. That's been put to the UK government, and that raises interesting questions, I think, as to the extent to which AI really should be included in regulation of the movement of goods, for example. But that's going to be an interesting one to follow, and I'm sure there's going to be other pieces of legislation coming through from the EU side, which it will want to see added to the Windsor Framework, and that then raises the question whether there'll need to be a vote in the Assembly, or whether the UK government will continue along the line it adopted earlier this year by saying, actually, we don't think it's going to create a trade barrier, therefore we don't need an applicability motion. I suppose one thing we should also mention about the way in which the UK government responded, it indicated that essentially it was not going to allow UK legislation or GB legislation to diverge such that there would be new tensions in GB NI movements of goods. So precursor to that, just point Viviane was raising about the UK gradually accepting the need for some degree of regulatory alignment with the EU. Okay, so that's a few things to be thinking about and watching out for in the coming months and years. It will certainly be giving us plenty to think about, and no doubt we'll be coming back to discuss some of these issues in due course, along with, as Katie said, some further polling that we'll be doing in due course. Okay, so now over to you for Q&A. I think we've got a couple of questions coming through, so thanks very much for those. We've got one here. I think it's going to be more for Viviane. Is it shaping up for us having a carbon border along the Irish Sea? And would that make things easier from an administrative point of view? Are we going to get a carbon border down the Irish Sea?
I think we were going to get a carbon border down the Irish Sea if there hadn't been an agreement. The problem is we may still get it, or we may get it for a few months, depending on how quickly the ETS-CBAM link happens. I think the direction of travel is very much, the EU has been actually quite, there's a bit less oomph behind the European Green Deal in the last, since the election in May. And so what we're seeing is that there's a bit more openness to delay the start of big policy change. So I think the direction of travel is much more likely we're going to get, hopefully in the next few months, by the end of 2025, some clarity around the shape of the deal. And then if that means that there is some delay in applying CBAM, just so that we can catch up with it, I think that's where we're heading. But I may be widely optimistic about this.
I think one with a bit of optimism. Billy, do you want to give us your take on the reset and its significance for the Windsor framework, coming from more legal background? And also mindful that you've obviously have written about the interaction between the TCA and the Windsor framework and difficulties that often creates. Do you think we're actually going to see many of those issues resolved?
Well, I think in terms of significance, Viviane did a great job of explaining that. I think it's something which would have been unthinkable just a year ago. And what we see here is an acceptance that the trade relationship between the EU and the UK, this represents a radical shift in the nature of the trade relationship. It's no longer, before we had an arrangement which was very much focused on trade liberalization as understood in the classical sense, which was really, we had a trade agreement which presented itself as comprehensive and ambitious, but really only focused on trade in goods and mostly on tariffs and quotas. So very much the classic trade issues that people were discussing 60, 70 years ago. It didn't do anything as far as regulatory issues were concerned. And that reflected the previous government's focus on its red lines, that it wanted to have the flexibility to set its own rules domestically, but also to make regulatory commitments in its external trade relations with third countries. That didn't really happen in practice, right? The trade agreements that the UK has signed with third countries are also mostly focused on tariffs, but it wanted to have that flexibility, and which is why the idea of committing to legally binding commitments on regulatory issues with you was so problematic. So I don't think we can really understate how radical this shift is, that all of a sudden the UK is now much more open to a deep trade relationship where it commits to dynamic regulatory alignment. And for Northern Ireland, that has obviously huge repercussions, right? Because what it means, and you're one of the few people who read my paper, it means that Northern Ireland's trade relationship is no longer, they've potentially chipped away at this unique nature of Northern Ireland trade relationship, where it has a completely separate arrangement in relation to the EU. By potentially signing an SPS deal, an ETS deal, what we're doing is bringing Northern Ireland closer to GB, in the sense that its relationship with the EU is now governed more by the broader UK-EU relationship rather than having a separate agreement. And that's a really important shift. Mm-hmm. And it works in the sense that the UK has a better relationship with the EU, the entirety of the UK, not just a portion of the UK, but more fundamentally, it allows Northern Ireland to have a closer relationship with the rest of the UK, with GB, right?
There's an interesting dynamic there is, okay, you by through this common understanding, if all these elements fall into place, then the uniqueness of Northern Ireland's position lessens. And so that actually,
while still achieving the fundamental aim of the protocol, which was to avoid barriers to trade within the island of Ireland. Right.
okay. Viviane, can I just ask you, you obviously only had a limited amount of time there to reflect on a certain aspect of the reset. From your perspective, are there other key takeaways from that reset which you think are important for Northern Ireland and the Windsor Framework?
I mean, I think it is actually quite interesting because we don't really watch much what is happening in the EU, usually in UK media, all that, is that the direction of travel we're seeing in the UK in terms of what is high on, political leaders' agenda is actually quite similar to what is the case for the EU. So when we're talking about the focus on growth and on making sure that you have a just transition, but that doesn't leave industries too much behind, this is something that actually unites leaders on both sides. Now, from an environmental perspective, that's not necessarily very good news. What you're seeing is a lot of lowering ambition on both sides, which then makes it easier for them to work together. So for a long time, we had that concern that the EU and the UK were going to go in completely different direction, and that was going to make it very hard for them to work together. But actually, they're both being less ambitious, and so they can meet in the middle. So it's a good news for UK-EU relationship, maybe a bad news for the planet.
Okay. Okay, right. Katy, I've got two questions for you. One, is there anything from the reset which you think we should really be adding to or noticing in addition to what we've said already? And then secondly, going back to point which we picked up in the polling, or we addressed in the polling, was around the Windsor Framework, independent review of the Windsor Framework and what that might do. What do you think we can expect from that? So
I'll take your first question first. So on the reset, the thing that really strikes me is the challenge of governance. So they mentioned potential for new joint governance arrangements, but how will they link into the existing ones, the TCA and the Windsor Framework? And then the question of democratic deficit, which was there, even before Brexit, it was a concern that people had around EU membership, and it obviously becomes much more apparent in such a scenario. So will lessons be taken from Northern Ireland for that? We'll see. On the independent review, so as you noted, it's happening because of the wish to, or the hope to create consent across communities in Northern Ireland for the Windsor Framework. So the question will be, what shade of unionism in some way will Lord Murphy be attempting to reassure on this? And can you get from our polling data and then from maybe wider discussions that there is some portion of the population who will just not accept the Windsor Framework ever on grounds of principle? In that regard, perhaps this UK-EU reset is the best thing that could possibly have happened for the independent review, in that Northern Ireland, as you say, becomes less unique. So that is reassuring in and of itself on the grounds of principle of unionism. So that's a big help for him. But then we get into the limitations of what can be done through such an independent review. So it's just anything that the UK government itself can do rather than on the EU side. And then we come into areas of maybe practical or pragmatic concern. And for example, we know that a number of parties, but maybe particularly the Ulster Unionist Party, have been concerned around the operation of the Democratic Scrutiny Committee and its resourcing and its the power that it has and the capacity that it has to do its job. So that may be something practical that may end up being able to be of some assurance to softer unionists, and maybe bring them, remember that dotted orange line, bring them a little bit more towards thinking that's on balance a good thing. And then I'll be interested to see too the degree to which Lord Murphy might touch on other aspects of the Windsor Framework's implications and post-Brexit changes that have maybe had negative effects on Northern Ireland, potentially, for example, the issue of the electronic travel authorisation. So responding perhaps to concerns across communities in Northern Ireland, maybe the tourism industry, for example, be able to say this could be addressed, so slightly outside the scope of the Windsor Framework per se. So I'll be curious to see how much he touches on those practical things.
We'll see in July.
We'll see in July.
Yeah, okay. Look forward to that. Okay. We've got one more. It's a comment more than a question. It feels like we've all wasted 7 years and we're only now getting back to the more UK-EU alignment. I suppose where we are now with this common understanding, could we have been there 7 years ago?
Who you are?
I'm asking if we've all been following it. So.
I think this is a question for politics people.
Viviane, do you think we could have been?
I don't think we could have jumped straight into this.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was, a very clear political mood, especially in England, but not just in England, that, if you're going to go out, you need to go full out, or you need to, if we're going to go through through all the efforts of Brexiting, we might as well do something a bit different. And it is, I think, at this point, I want to spare some thought to the civil servants that have actually done all of that work to make it happen in practice, that the UK is diverging. Like when you talk about HSC, when it comes to pesticide and all that, you've got people who have spent years trying to make UK regulatory system work independently of the EU, and that have, perhaps bemoaned for years the fact that they don't have access to databases and they have to do everything with less capacity. But they've kind of managed to do it, and now we've got politicians telling them, by the way, don't worry, all of your hard work of the last few years, we can forget about it. So it must be quite weird for them, quite dispiriting, but at the same time, if you're going to be trading closely with the EU, it's a lot of, you should pick your battles, and you may want to diverge in some areas, but diverging across huge swathes of policy areas, it's just a lot of faff, really. So I think we are moving towards a direction where, a bit like Scotland and now the UK government as a whole, where we will pick where we want to diverge, pick where we want the UK to be different, but across the board be much more aligned. And I think should work for most people, but for a lot of people will say, well, what was the point of all that?
Any of you, Katy?
Comments on academics who have spent years working.
That's right. So I'm just very conscious that actually this next period, however long it's going to be before we have these new arrangements, is going to be actually quite tricky for Northern Ireland, because we're having to implement, we've got the border control post being finalised, and then the labelling, as you say, and so there will be this sense of, even more so, like we're having to implement this, and yet it's kind of pointless. Mm-hmm. So especially with the preparation for businesses, etc., to adapt to that, which may be 6 months or 12 months period, or may never be ending. So it's that continued uncertainty that we still don't yet know what the final arrangements will be.
I think it's also worth going back to, I think, one of the early lines in the common understanding is that the EU and the UK remain committed to the full and timely implementation of the Windsor Framework, withdrawal agreement, etc. So you're actually requiring to do things to demonstrate your trustworthiness in order to achieve something which then actually undermines.
But it's kind of pointless. It's ultimately pointless.
So a key thing, therefore, is going to be, what's the level of trust going to be like in 6-9 months' time, such as the EU might be confident, okay, we are going to have this new agreement with the UK, which will make redundant some of what's being done under the Windsor Framework, and therefore we can possibly step back a little bit.
When they're not allowed to do that.
Well
But not
you'd like to think this is where...
So you demonstrate, you gain trust by doing things that, in many ways you think this isn't really rational. Definitely not cost effective necessarily.
Yeah.
So it's going to be tricky.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll see how it plays out. I suppose I'd always come back to the point, okay, what was agreed last week is political. You've still got to translate that into mandates, and you've got to go through negotiations. You've then got to get those agreed. The agreements will probably need to go through the UK Parliament. They'll need to get some sort of sign-off within the EU as well. There's a lot that can happen in that time.
And Scotland and Wales giving consent.
We'll have to see. But it's going to be interesting times. Well, they've all been interesting times the last 7 years, and if not longer. Anyway, we'll come back with another post-Brexit clinic at some point. at the latest after we've done the next round of polling, where we're trying to get a sense as to what people in Northern Ireland think about what has been agreed here, at least on paper. And then we may pick up on some other issues, because I know Billy and Viviane are working on another interesting project particularly on trade issues. And yeah, in the meantime, wish everybody well, following everything that's going to be happening over the next couple of months, and hopefully see you again probably in the autumn sometime. Thanks very much for coming along. And if you want to review this, we will be sharing the link in due course. It will be on YouTube. So thanks very much indeed.